And if you want to move on from these things, you have to stop acting like it didn't hurt your feelings. I feel like a lot of times people say that you have to be tough or you have to be cold hearted or act like these things, didn't really affect you. But how are you going to move on? How are you going to heal if you keep ignoring it? That's simply just negligence on your side of the end. If you want to move on, if you want to feel better about these things, you first have to accept that they happen and accept how you feel about it. You have to be emotional and able to be mature, and able to grow. You have to be very in tune with who you are as a person and how you feel about these said situations. I feel like too many times people are neglecting how they feel or pushing it down below and not realizing that we're now inviting it to grow. We're inviting that hurt, to kind of change who we are as a person, and subconsciously it will. If we're not facing these things, if we're not actively trying to feel better about it or trying to move on, we're going to be stuck in that kind of cycle. And that cycle will simply just repeat itself time and time again, until we finally decide to break it. I feel like we have to be more upfront and open about these emotions. So many people are so scared of being vulnerable or even showing, the slightest emotion to someone they're talking to, or even the people close to them, because they feel like it is now weakness. And I feel like that weakness, or that idea that showing emotion means you care too much or you have to be nonchalant, is probably the worst thing spewed from media now. And it's become so normalized that you can't talk about these things. And it's kind of been a long standing of who you are and being a man, or whatever that thing may be. But you have to be emotional in that sense, or else you're going to kind of keep repeating these same things. You're going to be stuck in this cycle of hurt, just because you feel like you aren't experiencing any good or any love in that sense. You have to start seeing life as opportunity rather than hurt. That's the biggest difference. Stop seeing your life as an absence of love, but rather as a clear view. You have a clear view of what you want for yourself now and what you want for the people around you. Just because you're not experiencing so much romance, it doesn't mean that you now have no value or that you're unlovable. It just means you're on a different clock than everyone else. I feel like too many people have this idea that they have to have this love, or they have to have this person, maybe in order to feel better about themselves, or to feel like they're truly achieving, their walks of life. We have to realize that it comes from yourself first. How are you able to grow and provide for this person if you're so dependent on them? Now because you want to depend on someone else, who's going to depend on you? How are you going to be independent in this sense? We have to practice this emotional resilience. You have to stop feeling like you need other people, or you need, this level of love or comfort to feel okay within yourself. It all starts from who you are as a person and how you want to grow from there. How you want to be perceived and how you want to change. Stop trying so hard to, force this love out of people just because you want it so badly. I feel like that desperation can oftentimes, make us look so flawed, so weak in a sense, because we want it so badly, or because we want to feel, so much better about ourselves, or we're forcing these connections, we're forcing these things. And in the end, I feel like when we force connection, that is when the connections are the worst, because there is no real foundation. If this thing is only built on simply a attraction or something very minor, or opportunity, we have to realize that we're not trying to form anything with substance. And as soon as we stop having meaning with the things we're doing, there's no point in doing it at all, because we're in this constant cycle. We're in this constant loop of creating these things and talking to someone, then falling back in isolation, then falling back into solitude. We have to realize that we're not made to be on this constant roller coaster. That's not how you're supposed to live your life. You have to break that. You definitely have to break that cycle. Just because you talk to someone and it fails, and then you fall into isolation and kind of repeat this cycle time and time again, we have to realize that we're hurting ourselves. These same mistakes will continue to happen until we decide to break that cycle, until we decide to change something for ourselves, so that way this thing won't happen again. You have to evaluate how you're living your life and how much, energy and effort you're allowing people to take from you. I feel like a lot of times we're giving people so much that we don't even notice it. We're subconsciously allowing these people to hurt us, or these people to have us, in the sense that we're now, kind of in this repetitive pattern of hurting ourselves. You find so much comfort in being alone or having solitude that you kind of just bite and pick at little things and then kind of let it control who you are as a person. You'll never be able to move on or to break that cycle, or to feel kind of healthy overall by yourself, if you kind of keep buying into this mindset, buying into this idea that you have to do these things or that you need to be alone in order to feel okay with yourself. You know, you can feel okay at any time. And I think solitude and isolation has made people feel like they have to do that. You know, you have to be able to do this, and you have to be able to kind of move on in the sense. And it's made it so negative. It's definitely made it a lot harder to find kind of anything real in that sense. You know, just because people are trying so hard, we want to experience love, you know, to the max, you know, to have it and be grateful and not take it for granted. You know, you definitely have to hold on to that thing. And I feel like when we are acting kind of emotionless and acting like these things aren't affecting us in the end, we're doing ourselves a disservice. You know, that is the biggest thing we have to kind of cut out of our life, is this nonchalant role we're playing. You know, we have to be emotional. And I think being emotional is honestly one of the most prideful things you can do. If you're taking pride in anything in your life, it's pride that you can show your emotion and not let how other people see it, you know, determine you. And I'm not saying you have to tell people everything and tell everyone how you feel at this sense, but I'm saying when you're upfront about how you feel and you're aware that despite you're walking on eggshells in other people's lives, you know, you're being true to yourself, that is what it means. You know, you have to be your own person and your own, you know, selfish in that sense. You know, a lot of people feel like it's really negative to act like that, or you're hurting people when you're doing things like that. When you have to realize it's your life. You know, you get to determine who's allowed in your life and the things that you allow every single time. You know, you shouldn't have to mitigate how you feel for anyone. It's how you feel. You don't need any outside validation. You don't need any correction or appreciation. It's overall your life. You know, you shouldn't be walking on eggshells in other people's lives just because you don't want to say how you truly feel. You know, you have to be selfish in that sense. You know, ultimately, this is your life and how you feel comes first. I feel like a lot of people feel like they're helping other people when they're not saying how they truly feel because they want to spare feelings. When you have to realize that you're hurting this person in the long run. You know, this person is probably doing something or adding to something that actively hurts you or kind of makes you uncomfortable, and they're not aware of it. You know, because we're feeling like we're helping this person by not truly saying how we feel, a lot of times it's contradiction. You know, we're not helping anyone because now both people are experiencing this flaw and this problem because you feel like this thing might hurt other people's feelings. You know, if we were more upfront and emotional about how we felt in these, you know, kind of situations, ultimately relationships and connections would be easier to form. You know, people would be very clear with their intentions, to be a lot more genuine with these things instead of playing these mind games. You know, a lot of times it's just emotional calculations and people trying to win someone over or gain this thing for someone, and it's not an actual relationship. That is why it's so hard to fall for anything real. If we want to experience something real now, be emotional, like genuinely, like that's all you have to do, and things will come to you. You know, if you're allowing yourself to be the person you want to be, then the real opportunities that are actually for you will show themselves.